Happy birthday to us! Behavioral Health Today dropped its first episodes on April 20th, 2020. To celebrate our 1-year mark, we're releasing 5 shows this week, 1 episode each day. 2 will be brand new shows, and 3 will be some of our favorites from the past year. We hope you enjoy all of them, both new and old, and we're looking forward to year 2 of bringing you trending and relevant content in behavioral and mental health. Welcome to Behavioral Health Today, a podcast brought to you by the Triad Network. This podcast is designed to share trending topics occurring within the world and our communities and bring them a behavioral and mental health perspective. Today's topic of trauma stewardship is drawn from the work of Laura Vandernoot-Lipsky and her book Trauma Stewardship by Laura Vandernoot-Lipsky with Connie Burke. For more information about this book, the concepts presented in this show that come from Vandernoot-Lipsky and Burke, or the Trauma Stewardship Institute, please visit traumastewardship.com.
Welcome to Behavioral Health Today. I'm your host, Dr. Graham Taylor, and thanks so much for tuning in with us. I'm joined today by Dr. Lidia Michel. Lidia is a bilingual licensed psychologist dedicated to the community mental health field. Lidia has dedicated her career to the treatment of children and adolescents with special expertise in infant mental health, working with children 0 to 5 years old. She is also involved with the training and supervision of psychologists, the advancement of multicultural competency, individual and family therapy, and psychological assessment. Lidia has spoken to parents, mental health providers, crisis workers, and graduate students on the topic of sustaining their health when dealing directly with the effects of trauma in their work and their lives. Today, we're talking about how to create and maintain a sustainable mental health practice for those who find themselves called to work with tragedy and trauma. Lidia, welcome to Behavioral Health Today.
Thank you for having me. I'm so happy to be here.
So nice to have you. You know, Lidia, as we come to this topic, I'm thinking how often, as part of our work, it requires us to listen to sit with, and to hold our patients' stories of, more times than not, significant challenge, oftentimes trauma, experiences that are very distressing, painful, often even unthinkable sometimes, and profoundly sad. And it's a big ask for us professionally, but it's part of the therapeutic commitment, really kind of what we've signed up for. And we agree to lean into these issues to help folks work through these life experiences that are really preventing them from experiencing their fullest life possible. While therapists help others, they themselves may also experience what is referred to as secondary trauma stress, or oftentimes referred to as vicarious trauma. For the mental health professional, vicarious trauma experiences may directly and adversely affect the services that they provide, as well as really negatively impacting their own mental health. So I'd love to get into, as you work with mental health professionals, encouraging them and teaching them ways to develop and sustain a really healthy practice, help us understand and put into context for us what trauma stewardship is.
Well, I think the best way that I can describe trauma stewardship is it's really a way of capturing when any psychologist, therapist, social workers, really anyone who feels called to help alleviate the world's suffering. And so that can be people who work in the environment, that can be people who work with children like I do.
You bet.
But it's really, trauma stewardship is about a calling. So a calling to help, but holding in mind that the work does not define you and that the tragedies that you interact with aren't your own, and making self-care, balance, and a focus on compassion, and compassion that includes yourself, a key part of your practice. So it's relinquishing, identifying with our work in a way that it defines us.
Really good. Really good. When you are working with these folks, and what you're doing starting out today is kind of identifying, it can range from, it sounds like, first responders to mental health professionals, those that are showing up for and make part of their lives and part of their mission in life, professionally and personally, sitting with things that can be tragedy, things that can be traumatic. Where have you applied this type of work with these folks that you're meeting with and trying to help?
Well, I've worked a lot with graduate students, folks who are in training to become psychologists, but I've also had a lot of direct dealings with the community. I work out in California, and my scope and what I really like to focus on is community mental health. And so I've worked with folks who work in domestic violence shelters. I've seen parents in schools, administrators, presented at some community meetings for people who are directly serving under-resourced communities.
Really
So
good.
communities that don't have a lot of access to food, to healthcare, that in the past we would have called, risky neighborhoods and things like that. I
Yes.
like to say under-resourced because it's a
Yes.
representation of the systemic issues that lead to these troubles.
Yeah.
And I did a lot of training out in Chicago. And I think from early on, felt myself a calling to work with trauma and to folks who were suffering, specifically with children. I always felt called to work with kids and people of color.
You're talking about different types of populations that we might find ourselves with. My first work was in the community mental health as well for the Department of Health here. And in that population, there are myriad issues going on at one time. You talk about the systemic piece of it. You talk about the multi layers of needing for help in some very, very challenging times.
Yeah.
What are some of the issues that you see that create a demand for this type of training that you're doing with those you work with?
Well, I think particularly in community mental health, there's a little bit of a trend that folks who are unlicensed or newer to the field, they have so much passion, but they end up doing the brunt of the direct service
Yeah.
with the most impacted communities. So
Yeah.
they make up, I think, the higher percentage of the therapists that work directly in the homes, that work with our folks who are receiving services through like state subsidized healthcare and things like that. And so they're the least prepared, but the most impacted. And so they're receiving all these really impactful stories. And I think it's not to the field's benefit or to the benefit of the community for us not to help our early career therapists and psychologists to manage the impact that trauma will inevitably have on them as people. So I think that calls for it. And I also think, I have to reflect on the pandemic. And
Yes.
that, what psychologists, therapists, I heard someone say something recently that really struck a chord with me, that we're the second responders. We're not first responders, but we're sort of holding the emotional impacts of the pandemic. And it's something that's coming up in our work with kids, with families. It's there. When I think of trauma stewardship as like caring for the provider, of like how to care for those that care for others, I think too about our parents who maybe didn't have a job where they were called to care for others, but are now caring for their kids who are experiencing the pandemic while they're experiencing the pandemic. And so I actually think that the training is very timely.
Yeah.
Do you think we should talk about ways to recognize, like, when does my external reality impact my internal reality, become my internal reality in a way that is no longer working for me?
Yeah, that's really good. I'd like to get into that just a wee bit more in a moment, but you mentioned something about the passion with which we come into this field. And if we don't have that passion, we're probably not in the right field. That passion has to be there. You also talked about how, though, there can be kind of a little bit of a line of where our identity is also wrapped up in how we come in. So that passion, our identity are pretty closely attached to the services and the help that we provide, looking to help people work through things. And those are both good qualities, but they can also be a little bit of a slippery slope too, can't they?
Yeah. Well, I think about when we're so dedicated and it becomes so much of a part of our identity, what happens then when we're ultimately faced with the fact that we actually don't have control over what happens to our clients? What if something happens to them? If you are defined by being a good person, by being a good psychologist, how do you then sit with outcomes you can't control?
That's a great
What does
point.
that do to you? Yeah. There's a great quote in Laura Vandernoot Lipsky with Connie Burke. They wrote like the Trauma Stewardship book, which I'm going to reference a lot, and I want to give them credit for their great ideas. But they talk about that we enter the field with a fire, and that trauma stewardship is about tending to the coals.
That's really good. Really good. When you talk about trauma stewardship, the idea of stewarding ourselves in the healthiest possible ways is really the best place for us to be coming from, to be able to help folks. It's often very challenging. And if we are too tightly wrapped or holding on too tight, I think we can't provide the services that we have the potential and the heart to look to provide. I'm thinking about, given that this type of work involve the therapist experiencing prolonged exposure to these traumatic stories, and the fact that, these stories can have an emotionally accumulative effect. What are you teaching your supervisees and your professional community in, one, what are some of the signs and symptoms to be aware of? And then what are some next steps that you're encouraging them to take and consider regarding caring for themselves in this long-term work?
Well, I really use the Trauma Stewardship text, the book itself, as a guidepost. I can't encourage folks enough if you are in a leadership role or as a supervisor, or even just experiencing trauma through your clients, to read it, because it includes some guideposts of like, what are some signs that things aren't going so well? And I think some of these show up for us in small ways and large ways. They may not all show up for us, but I think it's creating a space for inquiry to ask, is this working? Am I comfortable with how this is showing up for me?
Please, I'd love to just kind of maybe name some things so we can be aware of and maybe catch them early. I think a lot of times we may not know what we don't know, and some things may be occurring that we haven't paid attention to, or maybe we're not mindful of. So please let us know.
I'm conscious of time, but I'll tell you about the ones that I think maybe are the most salient. And
Great.
the ways that I typically do this when I make presentations or with supervisees is I tell some stories. I think, human beings are storytelling creatures, and that's how we communicate some of these concepts. So I'll tell you some stories.
Love to hear a story.
Yeah. Well, so one of the concepts that comes up is a sense that no one can ever do enough. I feel like we hear that, like when you sit and you discuss a case and you're talking about just really heartbreaking things in supervision, or, when you're in consultation with other people who are doing the work, the sense of like, am I doing enough? What more could I be doing? And we've created a culture, at least I think in the field of martyrdom, where we praise people for their self-sacrifice. And we encourage people to give more and more and more. I think about in grad school, how little people slept. I don't know if that was a hallmark of your experience, but it would almost be like bragging rights. I remember driving to practicum and like clinical experiences, and folks would be like, "Oh, well, I only got 4 hours. I got 5," and it was this like, why are we celebrating how poorly we care for ourselves?
Right.
Because it's almost like we need to get the most out of ourselves, or else we're not good psychologists, we're not good clinicians. And the book encourages us to really look at like, what are our role models for our way of working? I think for myself, I was raised, in a Catholic education. A lot of my teachers were nuns. My first grade teacher, who I adored, she went on a mission to other countries. And I remember when she came back a few years later, how tired she looked and how I felt like she had aged 10 years while she was gone. But those are my role models.
Yes.
We've been given messages about how much we should work and to be good servers to the community, that we have to give up ourselves. And I think what's revolutionary about trauma stewardship is just really calling that out as a symptom of trauma exposure response. That when we've seen too much trauma, that then we engage in self-sacrifice, and we engage in behaving as if our work is so important. It's the only important thing.
Yeah.
So another sign that I think comes up for folks really often is minimizing. We think that we can't complain because we still have jobs, because we don't have COVID, right? Then we don't make space for the ways that we're not okay. And we don't make space for rest and for restoration. Other things that come up, the text talks about it as hypervigilance. I think I see it in the pace with which a lot of folks work, and I'll notice it in myself too, of how everything's an emergency and everything needs to be done now.
Like you're wound just so tight, everything gets that kind of a disproportionate reaction from you, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Arousal. Yep.
Yeah. How quickly we move through the day, constantly being on our phones, feeling like a sense of urgency around like, I've got to get to my email. And that sort of grounding and saying, I'm just one person. I'm going to do things with intention. It's a very different way of relating. One piece that doesn't get talked about much that I see a lot is diminished creativity. That when we work with folks who are in really tough situations, that sometimes we adopt their mindset that nothing will work, and of hopelessness. And even though maybe prior to the work would have been very creative about solutions, we adopt the same thinking that there's nothing that can be done.
Right. There's a real hopelessness in that. You're talking about how we, in the service of wanting to be of service, really end up with our bucket being empty. And in the process of maybe thinking that that's, martyrdom, or that's, really loving from the heart, or being sacrificial in our giving, and look how much I care and how invested that I am, we can't provide much from a personal well or vessel that's empty. What are we doing? And in
Right.
fact, we're at risk at those points. I mean, our ethics talk about, the impaired provider.
Yes.
And we are at risk at that point from working outside maybe even our areas of competence. We begin to kind of go in some gray areas, whether it's maybe not so much an area of expertise, or we begin to blur some boundaries, not with an intention to hurt, but just because we're
Yeah.
exhausted, tired, fatigued. And we think that this is the best way for me to help, to be more and more sacrificial. But we put ourselves and those we're trying to help at risk, don't we?
Yeah, that's where it becomes like an ethical line that
Yes, exactly.
caring for yourself serves your clients and it
Yeah.
serves your community. And it's a way to honor the work that you do.
Yeah. I think to reframe it like that is essential. And it tackles this martyrdom, this, I've got this heart that just can't
hmm
stop giving, and kind of reframes it in a way that says, come on, stop. And
hmm
let's look at how to be the best provider, and the provider that people coming to you need you to be. They need you to be whole and full and available to them with some really good personal and relational boundaries. So I think you're raising a great set of points here. When we talk about a sustainable practice, I know you've
hmm
kind of referenced things like creating a space for inquiry and
hmm
choosing a focus. Can you talk about some of the components that you would
Sure.
cover regarding a sustainable practice?
So when I talk about creating a space for inquiry, something that I've done with groups is that we need to really get back in touch with our sense of agency and self-efficacy. And
Hmm.
so to remind ourselves that everything we do every day is a choice and that we do this work because we choose to. No
Yeah.
one's making us, and if we didn't do it, there are good people who could do it instead of us. We
Yeah.
don't have to. We do it because we want to. And so if you do it because you want to, how do you want to engage in it? How intentional do you want to be? And I think to spend time with what brought you to the field?
Yes.
What did you want to do? What impact did you want to make? And how does your everyday life
Right.
honor that commitment?
Yes.
Because it's all a choice. I mean, I'll tell people like getting out of bed in the morning was a choice,
Yeah.
right? Logging onto Zoom was a choice. Yeah, you didn't have to, and you did. So
Yes.
I think another sign that we're getting worn out can be like this sense of persecution, as if our work is pushed upon us or something that isn't our choice, and that's just not true. So it's worth catching that narrative and really choosing to put our focus on our sense of agency. Other pieces I think was to frequently ask yourself, is this working for me?
Yes.
Wherever we're working, whatever work we're doing, whatever way we're working, is it working? What could I change? And to catch thoughts where we're thinking, oh, I could never find time to take a walk during the day, or I could never identify that, cut it in half. This is what I tell people. This is my spin on it. Cut it in half. Okay, cut it in half again. Okay, what does that look like? Does that look like a 5 minute like walk in place? Does it look like a 5 minute dance party? Whatever it is, make it
Yes.
so small that it feels tangible. And then just for 1 week, just do it.
I love the idea of being able to take something that we might think maybe minuscule or maybe not all that effective, but those little breaks, those little self-care moments, they can really help us decompress around some things, release some things, and also kind of fill our tank a wee bit, can't they?
Yep.
Yeah, that's good.
The other piece I was going to share about is choosing our focus, like what we're going to sit with, but also just building community and finding balance are two ideas that I really want to talk more about. And the idea that like we need to access other pathways. So when we're spending a lot of our time in a very emotional space, in a really heightened state of arousal, to work other pathways and to think about what were the creative activities that I engaged in before this was my work.
Yes, that's
Did I
good.
paint? Did I write? And to spend time in flow. That's one idea that I think is so important, of just losing ourselves in a task and being present in the moment, to give our brain some balance of different affective states that we can be in the moment. And I think the other piece too that I really try to speak to is community. So building a group of people who hold you
Yes.
accountable for caring for yourself.
It can be a rather isolative field, can't it? We go in, we hang our shingle, go into work every day, and we
Mhm.
check out, and we may not see anybody all day long in terms of a colleague. So it can be very isolative.
Oh, absolutely. Well, one of the things that I talk a lot about is to notice when you're only spending even your social time with
Yeah.
other providers or with
Yeah.
other people who are in the field.
Right.
because there's probably something on some level that's leading you to only want to spend time with people that are going to validate your self-sacrifice, that are going to encourage you, versus spending time with people in other fields who might say, it's pretty odd that you work on the weekends.
Right.
It's pretty
Right.
odd that you work till super late. Like, I don't do that. And we end up isolating ourselves or even feeling so overwhelmed with work that I just need to rest. But then our rest is watching TV. We're really actually numbing.
Yeah, really good. Really
Yeah.
good. I like the idea of when you present it like this, it's coming into a healthy stewardship very intentionally and being purposeful about it, weaving it in to your thinking about how you want to practice in the same way that you would take courses on being able to provide a service. You're talking about ways to provide a service to yourself. This idea of martyrdom, this idea of having too much passion where you lose your boundaries, or the self-sacrifice where you're not a full vessel and you're not helping people. It's really counterproductive in that way. You know, you mentioned earlier personal stories. We love personal stories on our show. And I know we're kind of coming close to our time, but would you share a personal story with us if you're comfortable, just of a successful training and something that comes to mind?
I mean, the time just flew by. This was
Yeah,
excellent. It was just really nice to share ideas. In terms of a successful training, I think part of what helps me feel a sense of efficacy over my work and feel that these ideas are making an impact is when people reach out to me afterwards and they talk about, like, I want to share this idea with someone else and I want
yes,
to, and I have had some like nice interactions. I'll set up an expectation of, like, in the next week, everyone set an intention. So we'll
yeah,
set an intention for something they can do. And it might be, a meditation, a dance party, even I'm just not going to work this weekend. I love that one. That's a good one.
yes.
Someone who I trained with a while ago, there was some extra commitment. And she's like, I'm going to say no because I'm practicing trauma stewardship. Like, oh, I love that.
That's
So
good. That's
I
good.
think for me, it's like I look for those like small moments of change, or
Yeah,
when someone tells me I took a break during the day,
it's really
or
good.
I was sick and I didn't come to work.
Yeah, that's good.
That's success. Like, I love that.
Really good. That's some great self-care. I'm also a big proponent very early in our training and even throughout our practices to enter into a therapeutic relationship with another provider, somebody who can be
Yes.
there for you, basically being
Mhm.
able very early on to help you understand your own stuff and what you're bringing into therapy, make you
Yeah.
mindfully and attentively aware of how to recognize what you bring and what your stuff is and what you're going to be drawn into or pulled into. And also along the way, when some challenging things are going on, just to have somebody that knows you, that can be
Mhm.
a safe space for you to go into and kind of check things out and kind of help read your meter and give you a place to work through some of these things that we're
Mhm.
required to hold in order to provide the help that we want to provide.
Yes. Well, I think you're speaking to creating a culture
Yeah.
that points out when you're engaging in ways that aren't sustainable and
Yeah.
that don't honor your commitment to the field. And
That's right.
we need those folks. I think I too often see people who are willing to just tell you how great you are and to really reward you for overworking. I think we need to make connections with more folks who tell us what's going on for you that you feel like that needs to happen. Like, this is
Right.
a few times now. I think right now we're engaging in a culture that demands too much of us, and that won't work. Like, I
Yeah.
call me on my stuff. Like, that those are the people you want around.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. Someone who calls us on our stuff. Exactly. Someone that we entrust ourselves to that just says, hey, can we take a look at this? Because I think there's something going a little bit off the track here or something that we want to kind of put our eyes to. So yeah, I love that idea of having our own space, like you said earlier, built into our own personal community of I have my own therapist that I
Yeah.
entrust myself to so that I can be the therapist that I want to be and the person that I want to show up with those that come to see me. You had talked earlier about some resources that you use, that you recommend. I would love to hear what you'd suggest to us to further our understanding in this area.
Absolutely. And, I want to comment on just what you were just saying, Graham, about
Yeah.
our own therapy. And I think to really normalize how many of us enter the field really because we have had our own trauma experiences. And when
Yeah.
that's a factor for us, and even when it's not, it shapes the way that we engage with the work. And so I
Yeah.
think to be consciously thinking about, is this about my journey or their journey? The work is about their journey. And what will I do for mine? But some really good resources I
You know,
can't
just
say
just
enough.
around just around that, just real quick. People back in the day would say, "Well, Graham, you just got into this field because you just want to try and understand yourself." And I was like, Absolutely. That's why I
Yeah.
get to feel. I want to understand myself. I want to understand how things work, and out of that experience comes what you just said. Out of that comes the work that we find ourselves being able to do. And I think it's a beautiful mission that comes out of our own lives. Not that we're doing our own work with those that we see, but it's informed by what the process can look like and what life can be experienced as when we're understanding how things work. I like that. That's good. So give us some resources, please.
So some resources. I really encourage folks to read Trauma Stewardship, an Everyday Guide for Caring for Self While Caring for Others by Laura Vandernoot-Lipsky with Connie Burke. The Gifts of Imperfection by Brene Brown, I think is also excellent.
Love Brene Brown. Yeah, she's
Love
awesome.
her. Well, and I think she's great at pointing out a culture of perfectionism in our work. And this book in particular, I think really hits home.
She really holds that idea too around just being able to be vulnerable.
Yes.
And the whole idea around vulnerability, and really what the theme of one of the themes you're talking about today is, if we can create healthy spaces for ourselves, community, sustainable practice, that requires us to maintain a spirit of vulnerability as we expose ourselves and also to those that can be supportive to us. So that vulnerability around Brene Brown is a great reminder to us. Absolutely. Other resources.
Well, and to your point, Graham, about the trauma stewardship, it really requires a certain level of vulnerability, of being able to look at and to say, this isn't working for me and I'm not okay. And being a helper is not insurance. It's not a guarantee that we won't also need help.
That's right.
So other resources, I just really love to encourage folks to look at positive psych research. Martin Seligman, Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, they have beautiful ideas. Martin Seligman in particular has really pushed the APA to look at not just human suffering, but human happiness.
You bet.
Yeah.
You bet. When we talk about the human suffering piece, we can refer to the therapist piece as kind of that vicarious trauma. But on the other side of that, we wouldn't be doing a good job if we didn't complete the circle with, there's also vicarious resilience. This idea, we're going to be talking in a later show about the resilience that gets developed, both for those who are helping work through their issues, but also for us as therapists. We get to grow as well. There's a vicarious resilience that we walk away with and grow from as well in the work that we get to do. So there's a really beautiful kind of beginning and end to that in working with some of these tragedies and traumas that we show up for. Really good.
Yeah,
really good. Well, I think what you're so articulately putting out for us today is that this self-care is critical and really essential to the longevity within our careers and for the services that we really want to provide and for us to be effective in our work. So Lidia, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been awesome to be with you.
Oh, my pleasure. That flew by. It was really lovely to share ideas, and I really appreciate you having me here.
Man, it's been our pleasure. That's been our pleasure. And to our listeners, thank you as always for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you next time on Behavioral Health Today.
Hey, behavioral health fans, we want to hear from you. If you have an idea for a show topic that you would like covered in a future episode, go to triedbehavioralhealth.com/behavioral-health-today and click on the Send Us Your Idea button to submit a topic. We appreciate all the support from our community, and if you like our show, one of the best ways you can support it is by giving us a 5-star rating and leaving us a review. Behavioral Health Today is a podcast part of the Triad Network, all rights reserved.